He hadn't cried since the day he buried his mother back when he was 17 years old. He hadn't let anyone get close enough to matter since then. For 28 years, Nathaniel Calloway ruled 2,000 acres of grass and cold silence, a man carved out of stone and wind. Then she came into town with a single leather trunk, a Philadelphia accent, and no fear of anything at all. She asked him a question nobody in that town had ever dared to say out loud. What happened after that broke apart everything he had built around himself. Stay with me until the end, because this is not the love story you think it is. If you're new here, subscribe and join our family. You won't want to miss what's coming. Leave a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first hard frost of October came early that year. It rolled down off the peaks sometime before sunrise, coating the fence posts and the dead grass along the road in a thin silver varnish that caught the early light and made the whole valley look briefly like something out of a painting nobody actually wanted to live inside. Beautiful from a distance, brutal up close. Nathaniel Calloway noticed the frost the way he noticed most things. No commentary, no sentiment, just a fact that required adjustment. He put on an extra coat before he went out, checked the water troughs before they could freeze over, and had already put in 2 hours of work before the rest of Cedar Hollow had rubbed the sleep out of its eyes. That was the rhythm of his life, had been for a long time. He was 53, though. Most people who didn't know him would have guessed older. Not because he looked worn down, but because he carried himself with the kind of settled weight that usually takes more than one lifetime to build up. His hands were big, scarred in more than one place. His face was weathered in that particular way Wyoming weather tends to weather a man who spends most of his life outdoors. Not exactly handsome, but the kind of face that made you feel, without quite knowing why, that this was a man who had seen things and kept quiet about them. He owned the Calloway Ranch, 2,000 acres of grazing land and timber that bordered the west end of the valley, marked on one side by a creek that had no name on any map, but that the locals just called Calloway Water, because Nathaniel had been tending its banks since before most of them were born. He ran cattle, kept horses, employed 4 hands year-round and 6 more during calving season, paid fair wages, expected hard work, and mostly stayed out of everybody else's business, on the condition that they returned the favor. Mostly they did. The people of Cedar Hollow respected Nathaniel Calloway, the way you respect a mountain range from a distance, with a certain amount of awe and no real expectation of warmth. He showed up when it mattered. He'd carried 3 families through hard winters. He'd organized the volunteer effort when the Tanner barn burned down back in '87. He was trustworthy, in the deepest sense of the word. The kind of man you want beside you when something goes seriously wrong. But you didn't invite him to dinner. You didn't ask him personal questions. And if you were wise, you didn't look too long at whatever lived behind those gray eyes. Because the few who had tried to get close enough to really see him had come back saying there was nothing there. Just distance that faded off into infinity, like looking across the plains on a cloudy day when you can't find where the land ends and the sky begins. Nobody wondered much about it since he'd never married. They assumed they understood. Some men just weren't built for it. Eleanor Whitfield arrived the second Thursday of October on the afternoon stage from Laramie. She was 32 years old. She carried a single leather trunk that was heavier than it looked, and she had that kind of direct gaze that made certain people uncomfortable right away, without her ever intending it. She wasn't what Cedar Hollow had expected when the school board wrote to a placement office back east asking for a teacher. They'd expected, without saying so out loud, someone more accommodating. Someone who would understand this was a frontier town with frontier ways, and who wouldn't complain about the condition of the schoolhouse or the spotty attendance of ranch children during the busy seasons, or the board's general conviction that a woman's authority in a classroom was something to be lightly managed by the men who paid for it. Eleanor Whitfield seemed well aware that was the arrangement everyone expected. She stepped down off the stage, took in Cedar Hollow's main street with the calm, appraising look of someone sizing up a piece of furniture she wasn't yet sure she wanted, thanked the driver by name after reading it off his jacket pocket, and asked the nearest passerby, who turned out to be Walt Higgins, the feed store owner, where she might find the schoolhouse. "Down past the church, ma'am, though it isn't much. Might need some work." "I certainly hope so," she said pleasantly, and walked off with her trunk rolling behind her over the uneven boards. Walt Higgins stood there watching her go, and later that night told his wife he didn't know if she was the bravest woman he'd ever met or the most reckless. His wife, who had lived in Cedar Hollow for 22 years and was tired of that particular distinction being made, said the two were usually the same thing. Nathaniel didn't meet Eleanor Whitfield until 3 weeks later. He'd heard about her, of course. In a town of 300 people, news of a newcomer travels faster than weather. He heard she'd painted the schoolhouse herself. He heard she'd taken on Everett Boone at a school board meeting over the state of the books and won. He heard she'd ridden 6 miles out to the Delgado place on a bad road because one of the Delgado children hadn't shown up to school in 2 weeks, found the family struggling, and quietly organized what she called a traveling library, which was functionally a donation drive with a nicer name. He heard all this and didn't think it was particularly extraordinary. Sounded like a capable woman doing work that needed doing. The frontier had always attracted capable people. That was how you survived out here. He met her for the first time in Dorothy Cole's general store on a Tuesday morning the first week of November. He'd come in for feed invoices and a roll of wire. Eleanor was examining a display of school supplies near the front window, ink jars, chalk, a set of slates, with the focused concentration of someone doing a budget in her head. She wore a dark green wool coat, perfectly practical, and had a small ink stain on her left cuff she either hadn't noticed or didn't mind. Nathaniel collected his invoices from Dorothy, grabbed his wire, and was nearly at the door when he heard her voice behind him. "Excuse me, are you Nathaniel Calloway?" He turned around. She was looking at him directly, unapologetically, the way people usually only looked at him when they needed something fixed or wanted a favor they hadn't figured out how to ask for yet. "I am," he said. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and businesslike. "I heard you used to sit on the school board, or used to." "Resigned 2 years ago." "I know, I heard that too." She tilted her head slightly. "I heard you resigned because Everett Boone wanted to cut the school term by 6 weeks to fit the harvest calendar, and you thought that was short-sighted." Nathaniel looked at her a moment. "Who told you that?" "Walt Higgins told me you used the word barbaric." "Might have used that word." "I wanted to thank you," she said, "even if I wasn't there to make the same argument this time." There was something in her voice. Not quite sarcasm, more like she was stating a fact that happened to have an edge on it. Nathaniel noticed the edge and chose not to engage with it. "Boone will find out eventually. Already has." She smiled then briefly, and it changed her whole face, considerably less formal, more genuine. "He told me school teachers are temporary by nature, that eventually we all get married and leave." "That's an opinion of Everett's," Nathaniel said carefully. "It is," she nodded. "What's yours?" He hadn't expected the question. He studied her for a second, this school teacher from Philadelphia with ink on her cuff, apparently unaware she was talking to a man who'd managed to end most conversations in this town in under 30 seconds for almost 2 decades. "I think," he said slowly, "that a teacher who stays long enough to actually know her students is worth 10 who come and go." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "That's a reasonable opinion," she said. Then she turned back to the slate display, and he walked out of the store. He didn't think much about the conversation the rest of that day, but he thought about it that night sitting by the fire, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and couldn't quite explain what there was to think about. It had been an entirely ordinary exchange. A woman had introduced herself, they'd talked briefly, he'd given an honest answer. The problem, if it was a problem, and he wasn't sure yet that it was that nobody had asked him for an honest answer in a long time. And something in the way she'd asked made it seem like she was actually going to use whatever he said. He went to bed and didn't dwell on it further. That was the story, he told himself anyway. November deepened into something serious. The days shortened fast the way they do in that part of Wyoming, and the cold that settled over the valley was the kind you feel in your back teeth. Nathaniel worked his men hard through the first weeks, moving cattle down to the lower pastures, mending fence sections that had weakened over the summer, laying in supplies for a winter the sky was promising would not be gentle. He ran into Eleanor Whitfield 3 more times before December, once at the post office, where she was sending what looked like a considerable stack of letters. Once on the road between town and the Hendricks place, where he was riding the fence line, and she was walking that same stretch, apparently on her way to visit the Hendricks children. He offered her a ride. She accepted without the usual polite refusal ritual, and swung up behind him on the horse with the practical competence of someone who'd grown up around them, which surprised him enough that he asked her about it. "My grandfather kept horses back in Vermont," she said from behind his shoulder. "I spent summers there." "Vermont's not exactly Wyoming." "No," she agreed with a certain dryness. "The fences are better." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but close enough that one of his hands, had he been present, would have raised an eyebrow considerably. The third time he saw her was in the church hall during the informal town Thanksgiving gathering, not the service, but the meal after it, which drew a much wider crowd. He stood near the back, as was his habit at any gathering he felt obligated to attend, eating, without particular enjoyment, and watching the room with the distant patience of a man who has learned to be present without being reachable. He noticed Eleanor sitting with the Delgado family, the same one she'd gone out to visit in October. The youngest Delgado girl, who couldn't have been more than 7, and was known to be painfully shy, was leaning against Eleanor's arm with the boneless trust of a child who has decided someone is safe. Eleanor was talking to the girl's mother, and without making anything of it, had put her arm around the little girl's shoulders. Nathaniel watched this a moment longer than he meant to. Then he looked away and finished his food. The question came the second Saturday of December, 3 days after the first real snowfall of the season buried the valley under 14 inches, and then stopped just as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a stillness so complete you could hear your own pulse. Nathaniel had come into town for supplies of the practical sort: salt rope and new axe handle. He stopped at Dorothy Cole's store, picked up what he needed, and was tying down his saddlebag when he heard boots on the porch boards and looked up to find Eleanor Whitfield stepping out of the store. She stopped when she saw him. The cold had colored her face, not prettily the way it's sometimes described, but practically, the way cold actually does, reddening her nose, sharpening her eyes, and making her breath visible in small white clouds. "Mr. Calloway, Miss Whitfield." She set her basket down on the porch rail and adjusted her coat, looking down the street where the snow had turned to gray slush from the wagon traffic. Then she looked back at him, with an expression he had trouble reading. Not quite hesitation, but something close. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." She paused, and he noticed the pause because she hadn't paused in any of their previous conversations before saying anything. She said things when she had them to say without the usual social cushioning. "Why did you never marry?" The question dropped into the cold air between them and just stayed there. Nathaniel went very still. He was aware of the horse shifting its weight behind him, of the distant sound of someone splitting wood 2 streets over, of the pressure of the question against something he hadn't let anyone touch in decades. Every answer that had ever served him before passed through his mind in quick succession. Too busy. The ranch takes everything. Never met the right woman. All true enough to get by on. None of them true in the way that actually mattered. He looked at her face. She wasn't looking at him with pity, or with the morbid curiosity of someone collecting gossip. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at that school supply display in Dorothy's store. like she was genuinely trying to understand the cost of something. And something in him, something that had been quiet for so long he'd nearly forgotten it was there, broke loose without warning. "Because I was waiting for you," he said. The words came out before he decided to say them, and that was the most frightening part of the whole thing. They hadn't come from thought. They'd come from somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't ask permission. Eleanor Whitfield stared at him, the color already in her face deepened, her hand tightened on the porch rail. "That," she said after a long moment, "is either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me or the most dangerous." "Might be both," Nathaniel said. His voice was lower than he meant it to be. She picked up her basket. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. "I'm going to need to think about that," she said. "So am I," he said, honestly. She stepped off the porch and out into the muddy street, her boots leaving clean prints in the gray snow. Nathaniel stayed at the hitching post, one hand on the saddle, and watched her go, and felt the very specific terror of a man who has just told the truth to someone who might actually believe him. He rode home in the cold, with the words still sitting in his chest like something he'd swallowed and couldn't fully digest. And when he got back to the ranch, he sat on the porch in his coat, which was foolish at that temperature, and watched the mountains until the light faded. He had waited 28 years to say that sentence. He hadn't planned on saying it to anyone. He had, if he was honest with himself, stopped believing there was anyone left to say it to. He wasn't sure whether he had just made the most important decision of his life, or simply the most reckless one. He suspected somewhere between the cold and the silence and the darkening sky that there was a reasonable chance they were the same thing. 3 days passed before Eleanor said anything to him. Nathaniel didn't go looking for her. It wasn't something he could do, not exactly out of pride, though pride certainly played a part, but because he honestly didn't know what he'd say to her if he found her. He'd already said the one thing he'd never planned to say to anyone, and he wasn't sure there were words available that could follow it without making things worse. So he worked. He worked the way he always worked when something was wrong. Steady, methodical, with a focus so complete that his hand, Jesse Cole remarked on Wednesday night, that the boss had fixed more fence in 3 days than most men managed in 3 weeks, and that he looked like a man either in love or in serious trouble, and that, in his experience, those were rarely separate conditions. Nathaniel told Jesse to go check the south pasture and went inside. Thursday morning, a note arrived with the feed delivery. It was written on schoolhouse paper. He recognized the plain, institutional letterhead, and it read in precise but unfussy handwriting, "I've been thinking. If you have time, I'll be at the schoolhouse Saturday morning. E.W." He read it twice, then folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and didn't take it out again, though he was aware of it all day, the way you're aware of a splinter you haven't decided to deal with yet. Saturday morning, he saddled his horse before dawn and rode into town through cold sharp enough to make his eyes water, arriving at the schoolhouse 20 minutes earlier than necessary, which he hadn't intended and which irritated him slightly. He tied the horse to the outside post and stood in the yard looking at the building Eleanor had painted in October. The boards were now a clean white that stood out sharply against the gray winter sky, and he told himself to stop being ridiculous and knocked on the door. She opened it right away, which meant she'd heard him coming, which meant she'd been waiting for him. That small fact settled something in his chest that had been unsettled all week. "Come in," she said. "It's warm in here, at least." The schoolhouse was small and smelled of chalk and the wood stove burning in the corner. The children's work was pinned along one wall, drawings, writing exercises, a map of the United States one of the older students had drawn with impressive precision. Nathaniel stood just inside the door and took it all in for a moment, with the feeling of someone who has just walked into a room he didn't expect to feel anything about. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee from an old tin pot and set them on the nearest desk, which was the teacher's desk, pushed to one side to make room for a small arrangement of 2 chairs that was clearly deliberate and that made Nathaniel feel, for reasons he couldn't name, both recognized and exposed. He sat in one, she sat in the other. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she was still working out. "I want to say something," she said, "and I need you not to interrupt until I'm finished." "All right," he said. "What you said last Saturday." She paused and started again. "It wasn't what I expected. Men have said things to me before back east. Charming things, some thoughtful. Occasionally things that were obviously calculated to produce a particular effect." She paused. "What you said didn't feel like any of those. And I don't know what to do with that, because I'm 32 years old, and I came out here to build something on my own, and I wasn't planning on this." "Neither was I," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said, and something in her voice suggested that was exactly the problem. He looked at his coffee. The steam rose in a thin spiral. He said carefully, "I'm not asking you to do anything about it." "No, no." She looked up. "I said what I said because it was the truth, not because I expected anything in return." "No, I'm not good at this. I want to be clear about that." "I can tell," she said without cruelty. "What I mean is, I don't have a plan here. I'm not going to pretend that I do." She turned the cup between her hands, the familiar weight of it something to hold on to. "I just thought I was tired of lying about it." She was quiet a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the schoolhouse walls with a low, steady sound. The stove popped. "I'm not good at this either," she said finally, in a voice slightly different from her usual one. Less composed, more careful, like she was testing the weight of the words before committing to them. "In case you were wondering, I have opinions about everything, and I'm told it's exhausting, and I don't know how to want something without also being afraid of it. And I've been here 12 weeks, and I already know this town is going to be a fight every single day. And I don't regret coming, but I'm not going to pretend it's easy." "I know it's not easy," he said. "I've watched it from the outside." He paused, choosing words. "The way the board talks about you, the way certain men in town—" He stopped, choosing words. "You've gotten to a place nobody expected somebody like you to get to, and you haven't apologized for it, and that makes certain people uncomfortable. And those people are going to stay uncomfortable." "And that doesn't bother you," she said, watching him. "No," Nathaniel said. "Why would it—" She looked at him another moment, and then let out a short, surprised laugh, nothing polished. She shook her head. "Most men in this town have managed to say something condescending to me within the first 10 minutes of conversation," she said. "You've just gone 60 without once suggesting I should be more careful about my behavior." "I don't see why that would be my business," he said. "No," she said. "You don't, do you?" She said it like an observation about something unusual, something she was still cataloging. They drank their coffee. They talked more easily than either had expected, moving from the schoolhouse to the school board, to the winter weather, to the stretch of fence on the north road the county had let deteriorate, which turned out to be something they both had strong opinions about. An hour passed without either of them noticing. When Nathaniel glanced at the window and saw how much the light had shifted, he felt the specific surprise of someone who has lost time somewhere pleasant and doesn't realize it until it's gone. He stood to leave, and she walked him to the door, and they stood on the small porch in the cold. He thought about saying something that marked what had shifted between them, some acknowledgement of the thing that was quietly without either of them signing anything beginning. What he said instead was, "I'll be at Dorothy's store Tuesday morning, if you need anything." It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't particularly significant on the surface, but she heard what was underneath it. He could tell by the way she looked at him. "I usually stop by around 10, she said. "I know," he said, and she smiled at that. He rode back to the ranch with the cold air around him and the white schoolhouse behind him, and something in his chest that, for once, wasn't just the weight he'd carried so long he'd stopped noticing it. It was something lighter. He didn't have a name for it yet. He was still trying to find one when everything changed. The telegram arrived on a Friday night, the third week of December, delivered to the schoolhouse because that was the address Eleanor had registered at the post office when she arrived. Nathaniel didn't know about it until Sunday, when he ran into Dorothy Cole coming out of the church hall, and she mentioned, with the soft urgency of someone carrying news carefully, that Eleanor had gotten bad news from back east and was taking it hard. He went straight to the schoolhouse. He almost didn't. He stood at the hitching post outside Dorothy's store for 2 full minutes, debating whether showing up uninvited was the right thing to do, whether she'd want company or solitude, whether he was reading too much into a situation that was still only 6 weeks old and still technically nothing definable. Then he thought about how she'd looked on that porch 8 days before, and he went. She opened the door in the same practical wool coat she always wore, which told him she'd been sitting inside with it on, which told him she'd been cold and hadn't bothered to tend the stove, which told him something was wrong in a way that went beyond ordinary trouble. "I heard," he said simply. She stepped back from the doorway to let him in. The stove was barely burning. He went to it without asking and started feeding it wood from the basket beside it. And behind him he heard her sit down heavily in one of the chairs. "My father," she said. "He's had a heart episode. They don't know yet how bad it is." Her voice was flat in that particular way voices go flat when someone is holding something very tightly together. "My mother's alone with him. My brother's in Philadelphia and can't get there until next week at the earliest." Nathaniel closed the stove door and turned around. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the floor. "I need to go back," she said. "I know," he said. "I can't." She stopped. Started again. "The school board will say I'm abandoning my post. Everett Boone will use it to argue that women teachers can't be relied on. I've been here 12 weeks, Nathaniel." She said his name without seeming to notice. She'd moved past formality, but he noticed. 12 weeks. And I already have to leave." He pulled the other chair over and sat beside her close enough that if she had reached out, she could have touched his arm, though she didn't. "The school board can say whatever it wants," he said. "Your father's sick. It's not that simple. It never is," he said. "You still have to go." She pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes, not crying, not quite. Eleanor Whitfield wasn't a woman who cried easily. He was beginning to understand that wasn't because she didn't feel things, but because she felt them somewhere deep and internal, and dealt with them there before they ever reached the surface. "I know," she said. "I know I have to go." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. The stove was starting to give off heat now, and the room was warming slowly. Nathaniel sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor beside her, letting the silence be what it was without trying to fill it. "When would you leave?" he said after a while. "The Tuesday stage to Laramie. I can catch the eastbound train from there Wednesday morning." She lowered her hands and glanced at him sideways. "It's a 3-day trip." "I know," he said. Another silence. Then, without having planned it, he said, "I'll come with you." Eleanor turned her head and looked at him fully. "What, I'll come," he said. He heard the words leaving his mouth and was aware they weren't the words of a sensible man walking away from a ranch in December, during the hardest month, with calving still months off, but the steady preparations already underway. He was aware of all that, and said it anyway. "You shouldn't travel 3 days alone." She stared at him. "Nathaniel, it's December. Your ranch, Jesse can handle it," he said, which was partly true. Jesse was competent, and Nathaniel had trusted him with the place for shorter stretches before. A week, maybe 10 days was different, but not impossible. "You can't just leave. I can decide what I can and can't do," he said, not harshly but firmly, the way he said most things. I'm saying I can. Eleanor was quiet a long moment. He could see her working through it. The practical considerations, the implications, what it would mean for the people in town to see him board that stage with her. The weight of accepting something from someone when she wasn't yet sure what she owed in return, or what the offer meant. Why? She said finally. It was the same quality of question she'd asked him the first time, direct, genuinely wanting the real answer and not a comfortable one. He thought about it seriously before speaking. Because 3 days on a train is a long time to carry something heavy without anyone to lean it against, he said. And why? She paused. Why you? Because I've been out of things long enough to know what it looks like when somebody else is about to be. And I'd rather not watch it happen when I could do something about it. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze, something that didn't come naturally to him in moments like this. It felt like standing in an open field during a storm, with no shelter anywhere. But he held it. All right, she said quietly. He nodded. I'll square things away tonight. She stood up too, and for a moment they were very close in the small, warm room, close enough that he could see the tiredness in her face, and the thing underneath the tiredness, which was fear. Real fear. The kind that doesn't announce itself as such, but lives in the set of the jaw and the slight tightness around the eyes. Thank you, she said, in a voice smaller than her usual one. Don't thank me yet, he said. I haven't been on a train in 11 years. I'll probably be terrible company. She laughed, and it was the most genuine sound he'd heard in that room. And it lasted only a second before she pressed her lips together and looked away. But it had been there, and it had been enough. He left her with the stove burning properly and rode back to the ranch in the dark, his mind already moving through what needed arranging, who needed telling what, the bare minimum for leaving a ranch in December looked like. There was a lot of it. It would take most of Monday to organize. He spent that Monday in motion, explaining things to Jessie with the focused brevity of a man who doesn't waste words, writing out a schedule for the other hands, checking the cattle twice, drafting a letter to the bank about a deferred payment arrangement on the feed account in case anything ran long. He didn't think too hard about what he was actually doing, leaving his ranch, leaving the valley, boarding a train, and traveling east across a continent for a woman he'd known 10 weeks. A woman who wasn't his, and hadn't said she wanted to be. Only that she was thinking about it. He didn't think too hard about any of it, because thinking too hard about it would have revealed the complete irrationality of the decision, and the decision was already made. And in his experience, unpacking decisions you'd already made didn't do anybody any good. Tuesday morning, the stage left at 7. He was at the station at 6:40, with a single bag which was all he ever packed for anything. Eleanor arrived at 6:50, with her leather trunk and a smaller bag over her shoulder, and found him already waiting in the cold. She stopped when she saw him, as though she genuinely hadn't been sure until that moment that he would come. He lifted her trunk and loaded it without comment. The stage driver, who knew Nathaniel and had shown visible curiosity ever since Nathaniel booked his passage the day before, managed to keep his expression carefully neutral with only partial success. They boarded the stage. It was not a comfortable vehicle. It was cold, the seats were hard, and the road to Laramie was rough at the best of times, let alone in December. They sat across from each other with 2 other passengers between them, a man from the mill and his wife, also traveling to Laramie for their own reasons. The conversation was necessarily general and shallow for the first 3 hours, but somewhere around midday, when the other passengers had drifted off with the rhythmic sway of the stage, Eleanor looked at Nathaniel and said quietly, low enough that only he could hear, "He collapsed in the kitchen. My mother found him." She wrote she said she didn't want to alarm me in the first telegram and then decided that was worse, so the second one said everything. She looked at her hands. "He's 68. He's never been sick before, not really. He's the kind of man who seems like he'll just outlast everything." "Those are often the ones that scare you most," Nathaniel said, "when something finally does get through." She looked up at him. "Was your father like that?" He considered it. "My father was tougher than the ground he worked," he said. "Used to think nothing could touch him. Then the winter of '74 took the cattle and what savings he had left, and he was never quite the same after." He paused. "Died in '79. Pneumonia. But that's not really what killed him." "What killed him?" "Quitting," he said. "When a man like that stops believing there's a point in going on, that's when things get genuinely dangerous." Eleanor was quiet, processing that. "My father never stopped trying," she said. "Even when the business was hard. Even when my brother wanted to take over the shop 5 years ago and father wouldn't let him." She looked out the window at the frozen landscape sliding past. "They haven't talked properly since. I spent years trying to mediate that, and then I realized I was just making it comfortable for both of them to stay exactly where they were, and neither one was ever going to actually change. So I just moved to Wyoming." "To anywhere," he said. "Wyoming was specific. Leaving was general." She looked back at him. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. "I understand leaving being the point of something." She looked at him with a question in her eyes that she didn't quite ask, and he didn't offer more, and she accepted it the way she was starting to accept the particular shape of his silences, not as walls exactly, but as rooms she hadn't been invited into yet, which required patience more than force. That night in Laramie, they stayed at separate hotels. Hers arranged by the school board as part of her travel provisions. His a boarding house on the same street that cost less and had a bed too short for him by 4 inches. He lay on it, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a city night he had almost forgotten, and thought about the ranch in the dark, about Jesse's competence, about whether the troughs would hold through the cold snap moving in. He also thought about Eleanor Whitfield, sitting across from him on that stage the way the winter light had come through the window and fallen across the side of her face, and the way she'd said, "My father," with so much compressed feeling in 2 words that it had taken him a moment to understand how much she was carrying. The train left at 7 the next morning. They found their seats side by side, second class, since the school board hadn't extended her travel provisions to first, and Nathaniel hadn't offered to cover the difference because he understood instinctively that she would refuse it, and that the refusal would create a small, unnecessary friction. The train pulled out of the Laramie station with the low groan of something very large and very heavy reluctantly getting underway. And somewhere between Laramie and the Nebraska border, as the plains opened up around them, flat and enormous and white, they stopped talking about safe things. It happened gradually, the way light changes outside a window, imperceptibly and then all at once. She told him about her years teaching in Philadelphia, 3 years at a school where the headmaster had called her aggressively competent and meant it as criticism. He told her about the winter of 1883, when a blizzard killed 40 head of cattle, and he'd sat in the barn for 2 days refusing to go inside because going inside felt like admitting something. She told him about a man back east, she didn't give his name, who had wanted to marry her and had been decent and respectable, and had made it clear he expected her to stop teaching once they had a household. And how she'd known the answer before he'd even finished proposing, and how her mother had cried and her father had gone very quiet. And then 2 weeks later her father had told her he believed she'd made the right choice, and how that had surprised her more than anything else in the whole situation. Nathaniel listened to all of it. He was a good listener. It was perhaps the skill he'd developed most in a life spent largely inside his own head. And he listened, without steering the conversation and without offering opinions she hadn't asked for, something Eleanor noticed and appreciated in the way you appreciate something you didn't know you needed until you find it. He told her sometime in the afternoon of that first long day on the train about the woman he'd almost married at 29. Her name was Sarah. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a quiet, steady woman who deserved someone better than he'd been at that age. Present in body, entirely absent in every other sense, closed off inside himself in a way he hadn't yet understood was a choice rather than a fixed condition. He'd known enough to end it before it went any further. Sarah had married a man in Cheyenne 2 years later, and seemed, from what little reached him, to be genuinely happy. "Did you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "No," he said. "What does that tell you?" "That it was never the right thing," he said. "The things I've regretted in my life, I knew it the moment I did them. There was always a moment where I knew. And Sarah wasn't one of those moments. No," he said. "It was a moment of recognizing that doing the wrong thing by someone is sometimes the most decent option available." Eleanor thought about that for a while, watching the darkening plains. Then she said, "You're more careful than you look." He turned his head to look at her. "Is that a compliment?" "I haven't decided yet," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. And outside the train window, the last of the light left the sky in a long, slow fade of cold orange. They had 2 more days of this. 2 more days on this train, moving steadily east through weather and flat land, and the particularly compressed world of a railway car in winter. 2 more days of conversation that did something underneath the surface, building something neither of them had named, and neither of them was sure they were ready to name. But when the lights of Chicago appeared through the frost-fogged window, their connection point still a day from Philadelphia, Nathaniel Calloway, who hadn't let anyone past a certain careful perimeter in 28 years, was fully aware that the perimeter was no longer where he'd left it. He didn't say anything about it. Eleanor didn't say anything about it. They watched Chicago pass in a blur of light and noise, then found their connecting car, and settled into their seats, and the train kept moving into the dark. Outside the window, the country was changing, the flat plains giving way to hills, then to the denser, older landscape of the east, which felt strange to Nathaniel in a way he hadn't anticipated. Everything was closer here. The trees, the buildings, the people. The space he'd moved through his whole adult life, that vast Wyoming openness he'd always taken for granted, was simply absent, replaced by a compressed, crowded world where nothing was very far from anything else. He sat with his shoulder nearly touching Eleanor's and watched the dark countryside move, and thought that distance was a strange thing. How could you spend years needing it and then find yourself on a train moving east through the night, feeling for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember that he needed it a little less? Philadelphia arrived, the way big cities tend to arrive when you've spent years living somewhere quiet, suddenly and without apology. The train pulled into the station on a gray Thursday morning, the sky the color of old tin, the platform full of people moving in every direction, with the particular decided urgency of people who considered this pace normal. Nathaniel stepped off the train and stood a moment on the platform with his single bag, letting the noise settle around him. The whistle of the engine, the shouts of porters, the overlapping conversations of hundreds of strangers, and felt, in a way he hadn't felt since his first years on the ranch, genuinely out of place. Eleanor was already moving. She had transformed somewhere between the last hour on the train and that moment on the platform. The careful, measured quality she carried in Cedar Hollow replaced by something faster and more alert. Her eyes scanning the crowd with the efficiency of someone reading a familiar map. She flagged down the porter. She pointed out her trunk with one finger and 3 words, and was back at Nathaniel's side within 30 seconds. "My mother's sending a car," she said. "Should be waiting out front." "All right," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "You look like a man who's been asked to disarm something." "Never been to Philadelphia," he said. "It's just a city." "It's your city," he said. "That's different." She looked at him a moment, and something shifted in her expression. A small acknowledgement of what he meant, and of how hard it was for him to say it, without dancing around it. Then she picked up her smaller bag and said, "Come on," and he followed her through the crowd. The car ride to the Whitfield house took 20 minutes, through streets narrower and older than anything he'd ever navigated before, the buildings crowded close on both sides, the bare December trees lining the sidewalks like people waiting for something. Eleanor sat across from him and watched the streets pass with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite relief at being home, not quite dread, something suspended between the two. "How long since you've been back?" he asked. 14 months, she said. "I came for my brother's birthday last October. Before I knew about Wyoming." She paused. "It wasn't a comfortable visit. Your brother and father, everything," she said. "My mother worrying." My father being my father. My brother managing to make every conversation about himself without ever saying anything directly about himself, which is a particular talent. She pressed her lips together. "And then I went back to Philadelphia, and 3 weeks later I applied for the position in Wyoming, and 6 weeks after that I was on the stage heading west out of Laramie." "Running," he said. "Building," she said with a slight edge, and then after a moment, "Maybe both. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't some running in it." He nodded, accepting that, and she looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd expected either an argument or an absolution, and wasn't sure what to do with the simple acknowledgement. The car stopped in front of a narrow 3-story house on a tree-lined street, brick-faced and respectable-looking, with a small garden that had been put to bed for winter and a brass knocker on the front door that had recently been polished. Nathaniel registered these details the way he registered all practical details, automatically, without judgment, storing them as information about the kind of people who lived there. The front door opened before they reached it. Margaret Whitfield was a small, compact, straight-backed woman, with Eleanor's eyes set in the face of someone who had spent several days managing fear through activity. She came down the front steps and took Eleanor's hands and held them, and the look that passed between them was the kind that only belongs to mothers and daughters who understand each other in the complicated way that women too much alike sometimes do. "You're too thin," her mother said by way of greeting. "I'm not thin," Eleanor said by way of reply. And the familiarity of the exchange, its precise and loving irritation, told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about their relationship. Then Margaret Whitfield looked at him. "Mother," Eleanor said firmly, "this is Nathaniel Calloway. He runs a ranch in the valley where I teach. He was kind enough to accompany me." A pause. Margaret Whitfield's gaze moved from her daughter to the big, weathered man standing in her front walk, with a single bag and an expression of careful composure, and back to her daughter, and she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds before saying, "Well, come in, both of you. It's cold." Which was, Nathaniel understood immediately, neither an agreement nor an objection, but a decision to reserve judgment until she had more information. He respected that. The house was warm and comfortably cluttered, the way places get when the same people have lived in them for a long time. Books stacked on side tables, an embroidery someone had started and never finished, hanging on the wall, a clock on the mantel that had stopped at 3:14, and that, apparently, nobody had bothered to fix. A house with real life in it, not just furniture. Eleanor went straight upstairs to see her father. Nathaniel stayed in the entryway with Margaret, who looked at him with the same directness as her daughter and said, "Would you like tea, Mr. Calloway, or would you rather have coffee?" "Coffee, if it's no trouble," he said. "It's no trouble," she said, and led him to the kitchen, which he understood immediately was where she preferred to have difficult conversations on her own ground, with something useful to do with her hands. She set the coffee going and stood by the counter and said, without turning around, "How long have you known my daughter?" "About 10 weeks, he said. 10 weeks, she repeated in a tone that didn't editorialize, though it clearly was doing so internally. And you left your ranch in December to travel across the country with her. Yes, ma'am. She turned then and looked at him. She wasn't an intimidating woman in the obvious sense. She stood maybe 5'2" and was 60 years old, but she had the quality of someone who had raised difficult children and buried disappointments without losing her balance, and that gave her a steadiness he recognized and respected. "Why?" she said, as direct as her daughter. He'd expected the question and hadn't fully decided during the 3-day trip what to say. He'd thought about what would be reassuring, what would be strategic, what would make a good impression on a Philadelphia woman who probably hadn't imagined her daughter coming back from the frontier, accompanied by a quiet rancher 20 years her senior. What he said instead was the truth, because it was what had worked with Eleanor, and because lying to this woman felt both pointless and disrespectful. "Because she shouldn't have had to make that trip alone," he said, "and because I didn't want her to." Margaret Whitfield looked at him a long moment. The coffee began to rattle in the pot behind her. "Eleanor has made difficult trips alone before," she said. "She's quite capable of it." "I know," he said. "That wasn't the point." Another pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet, but a recalibration. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it wasn't." She turned back to the coffee. "How long do you intend to stay, Mr. Calloway?" "As long as I'm useful," he said, "and not a day more." She poured the coffee and offered him a cup and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me about that ranch." So he did. He told her about the 2,000 acres, the cattle operation, the creek that had no name on any map. He told her about the winter rhythms, the summer work, what the valley looked like early on a July morning when the light came up over the eastern peaks and hit the grass. Not romanticizing it. He also told her about the isolation the brutal winters can, the fact that the nearest doctor was 30 miles off on roads that became impassable come November. He told her these things because he understood, without Eleanor's mother saying so, that what she was really asking was what kind of life her daughter would be choosing. "And have you thought about what you'd be asking her to choose?" Margaret said. "Eleanor has never been particularly interested in comfort," she said before he could answer. "No," he agreed. "She's been interested in doing work that matters," he said. "Since she was 8 years old, she's been interested in that." "She's good at it," he said, "the teaching. She's already changed things in that town, and she's only been there 12 weeks. Something crossed Margaret's face. Complicated pride, then. The particular sadness of a mother who has watched her child go somewhere she can't follow, and made the impossible calculation of whether it was worth it. "She wrote to me about the school board," Margaret said, "about the man who told her teachers are temporary by nature." "Boon," Nathaniel said, and couldn't quite keep the neutrality out of it. "She said you'd resigned from that board 2 years ago over a disagreement with him," she said, "before Eleanor got there. Said it was because you thought his approach was—" Margaret paused, apparently recalling the exact word. "Barbaric." "Might have used that word," he said. Margaret made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was clearly related to one, and looked down at her coffee cup. When she looked up again, something had shifted in her expression. Not entirely, but perceptibly. Like light changing when a cloud moves. "My husband," she said, "is going to have harder questions than mine." "I expect so," Nathaniel said. "He has strong opinions about what Eleanor should do with her life. They've never quite matched up with what Eleanor is actually doing with her life, and they've reached a kind of armed truce over the years, which means he worries privately, and she calls it approval when it isn't." She paused. "He likes independence in the abstract, finds it harder in the specific." "Most people do," Nathaniel said. "You don't seem to have that problem," she said, watching him. "I grew up somewhere where you either handled what was in front of you or it handled you," he said. "I don't have much patience for people who confuse competence with a problem." Margaret looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "May I see you settled in?" They took him up to the guest room at the back of the second floor, small and tidy, and clearly belonging to a house that didn't get many visitors. He set his bag in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house around him. Eleanor's voice upstairs, the murmur of a man's voice answering, Margaret moving around in the kitchen below, a family reassembling itself around a crisis, with a stranger in the guest room. And the strangeness of all of it settled around him without fully resolving. He met Harold Whitfield that night at dinner. Harold was in a chair in the sitting room when Nathaniel came downstairs, wrapped in a blanket, with the particular indignity of a physically capable man, reduced to temporary dependence, and clearly not the type to handle temporary dependence well. He was 68, with the sharp, thin face of a man who had always been handsome, and knew it. And he looked at Nathaniel with the direct, appraising gaze of a man who had spent his professional life sizing people up, and wasn't about to stop now just because he was wrapped in a blanket. "Nathaniel Calloway," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor had clearly told him about him. "Mr. Whitfield," Nathaniel said. "Glad to see you sitting up." "I've been sitting up since noon," Harold said, with some irritation that suggested somebody had argued with him about this and lost. "Sit down. Eleanor tells me you're a rancher." Nathaniel sat in the chair across from him. "That's right. Wyoming." "Yes," Harold said. "I've never been to Wyoming. No reason to." He said it without malice, simply as a fact. "Eleanor's written about it. Seems—" He paused. "Seems attached to the place." "She's done good work there," Nathaniel said. "She does good work wherever she goes," Harold said, with the absolute stillness of a man stating something he'd known for 30 years. "That's never been the question." He looked at Nathaniel closely. "The question has always been whether the places she chooses to do it in are worthy of what she deserves." "That's a fair question," Nathaniel said. "And I don't have an answer that'll satisfy you," he said calmly, "because the answer depends on what you believe she deserves. And I'm not sure our judgments are the same. She knows her own mind better than I do." A silence. Harold looked at him with an expression Nathaniel couldn't categorize. Not hostile, not warm, something watchful and still. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly," Harold said. "Eleanor described you in her letters, but she described you the way people described things they're still working out." Never finishing the sentence. Nathaniel said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been either revealing or dishonest, and he was trying not to be either. "She came home?" Harold said then, and something changed in his voice. Something dropped away from the controlled assessment, and what was left underneath was simply an old man who had been afraid. "She didn't have to. She could have handled it with telegrams, with distance. Could have waited to see if I pulled through." He looked at Nathaniel. "You came too." "I did," Nathaniel said. "Why?" The same question Margaret had asked, in that same kitchen with the same directness. These were, Nathaniel thought, with sudden clarity, Eleanor's parents. "Because I wanted to be useful," he said, "and because I didn't want her to be alone with this." Harold was quiet a long moment, his hands folded over the blanket in his lap, looking at Nathaniel with an expression that was still assessing but had softened at the edges in a way that cost him something. "She very rarely lets herself be alone with things," he said by choice. "Prefers to handle them herself." He paused. "Did she let you come?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She didn't let that other man come," Harold said. "The one before. When her grandmother was dying, he offered, and she told him it wasn't necessary." Nathaniel took that in without comment, but he took it in. That night after dinner, Eleanor found him in the small back garden. He'd stepped out for air, the closeness of the house beginning to press on him, the specific way enclosed spaces did after years in open country. She stood beside him in the cold, and they looked out at the bare garden together. "How did it go?" she said. "Direct," Nathaniel said. "He's always direct," she said. "He respects people who answer directly." She paused. "Did you?" "I tried," he said. She was quiet a moment. The city wasn't silent. There was always traffic somewhere, always some sound layered underneath everything. But in this small, walled garden, it was muffled enough to approach something like quiet. She pulled her coat tighter and said, "He asked me about you this afternoon, before dinner." "What did he ask?" "Whether I knew what I was doing," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was working on it." She glanced at him sideways. "He said that was either the most honest thing I'd said in years or the most worrying." "What did you say to that?" "I said they weren't mutually exclusive." "What did he say?" "He said," she repeated it slowly as though still processing it, "That's her mother in her." She paused. "That's about the closest thing to a compliment he gives." Nathaniel looked up at the sky, Philadelphia's sky gray-orange with city light very far from the absolute dark of a winter night in Wyoming. "He's afraid of losing you," he said to the distance, to a life he couldn't fully imagine. "I know," she said. "He's been afraid of that since I stopped teaching in Philadelphia. Wyoming just made it more specific." "You don't have to justify yourself to him," Nathaniel said. "I know that too," she said. "What I'm less clear on is what I'm justifying when I justify you." Her voice was firm and direct the way it always was when she said something that cost her. "Because we haven't. We haven't said." "I know," he said, "but coming here," she said, "with you, that said something even without words." "Yes," he said, "it did." A silence. Somewhere, a few streets away, a horse and cart moved through the dark. "Do you regret it?" she said. He turned to look at her. Her face, in the pale city light, was serious and very clear, not performing the question genuinely, asking it, needing an honest answer the way she always needed honest answers, as if she had a physical intolerance for anything less. "No," he said. "You," she held his gaze a moment. "No," she said. "That's the part I'm still getting used to." He nodded slowly. She looked back out at the garden, and he stood beside her in the cold, and neither spoke for a while. But it wasn't a silence that needed filling. The days in Philadelphia settled into a rhythm Nathaniel hadn't expected to find manageable, but did. He stayed out of the way of the family's private moments, the conversations between Eleanor and her father that happened behind closed doors, the careful negotiations between Eleanor and her brother Thomas when Thomas finally arrived from Pittsburgh on Saturday. All sharp edges and defensive posture, and the particular performance of a man who had been absent during a crisis and knew it. Nathaniel watched Thomas from a careful distance and understood right away that the trouble between Thomas and his father wasn't really about the business. It was really about Thomas needing recognition he'd never quite gotten in the way he needed it, and Harold, without understanding that what he thought were high standards, had read to his son as permanent inadequacy. He said none of this to anyone because it wasn't his business, and also because he was aware it was exactly the kind of observation that would please Eleanor, and making it would reveal how much attention he'd been paying to her family. Sunday afternoon, he found Harold sitting alone in the sitting room without his blanket, which was progress, reading a newspaper, with the focused irritability of a man who's been told to rest and is interpreting that as permission to read about things that annoy him. Nathaniel sat across from him without being asked, which Harold seemed to register as appropriate rather than presumptuous. "Doctor says another week," he said without looking up. "Sounds reasonable," Nathaniel said. "The doctor is younger than my overcoat," Harold said. "His sense of reasonable isn't calibrated to my schedule." He lowered the paper and looked at Nathaniel directly. "Are you going to ask me something, Mr. Calloway, or are you just here to watch me recover?" "Wasn't planning to ask anything," Nathaniel said. "Thought you might have something to say." Harold looked at him. The sound that wasn't quite a laugh which Margaret had made in the kitchen, which told Nathaniel exactly where Eleanor had learned it. "She's stubborn," Harold said. "You understand that." "I know," Nathaniel said. "Doesn't bend on the things that matter to her," he said. "Never could, even as a girl. Once she decided something was important, that was the end of the negotiation." He said it with the exasperation of long familiarity, and underneath it, unmistakable pride. "She'll teach those children, whether the town likes it or not." "I know that too," Nathaniel said. "And you—" Harold stopped, chose his words. "You're not asking her to be anything else." "No," Nathaniel said. "I'm not. I've known men who claim the same thing," Harold said, "and changed their minds once the inconveniences got specific." "You don't know me well enough to know if I'm one of them," Nathaniel said. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm just telling you what I know about myself." Harold studied him a long moment. The stopped clock on the mantel was still stopped. The fire was doing a good job in the hearth. "She chose Wyoming," Harold said finally in a different voice, quieter, stripped of the testing quality. "I didn't understand it at the time. Thought it was restlessness. Thought she'd be back within a year." He paused. "She's been writing me letters from there that are different from the letters she wrote from Philadelphia. Less careful. More like herself." He looked at his hands. "I don't know what that says about me, that she writes more like herself from 2,000 miles away." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "It doesn't necessarily say something bad," he said carefully. "Some people find their range out there, the place where there's enough room to be what they actually are." Harold looked up. "Is that what Wyoming is for her?" "I think it might be," Nathaniel said. "She'd have to answer that herself," Harold nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected and had been waiting for someone to say plainly. He didn't say anything that could be read as a blessing. He wasn't that kind of man. But he reached his hand across the space between their chairs, and Nathaniel shook it. A brief, firm, old-fashioned, conclusive handshake, and that was that. Both of them understood without further discussion. Eleanor found out about it later from her mother, who had heard it from no one in particular, but had eyes and had seen the handshake from the hallway. She didn't say anything directly to Nathaniel about it. But that night when the two of them were in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, she poured him a cup of coffee without asking, set it in front of him, and said, looking at the table, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You didn't try to win him over?" she said. "You just were what you are." That's what got through. He doesn't respond to persuasion. He responds to people who don't need him to respond. "I wasn't trying to manage him," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." She looked at him across the kitchen table in her parents' house, 2,000 miles from the ranch, in a city she didn't know, under a sky she couldn't fully read. And she thought back 10 weeks to a rancher, to a story that had gone around Cedar Hollow about a teacher from Philadelphia who'd painted the schoolhouse herself. She thought about the porch outside Dorothy's store, and the cold, and the words that had come out before he decided to say them. She thought about the train moving east through the dark, and the way she'd said, "My father," with everything underneath it. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. He hadn't planned what came next, which meant it came out simple, unguarded, and completely without strategy. "I don't know what we're doing," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't have this figured out." "I know," she said. "But I'm not interested in going back to how things were. Before you asked me that question, I don't want to go back to that." "Neither am I," she said. "Me where the table?" The kitchen clock ticked. "I don't know either," she said. That wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't a promise, and it didn't resolve anything in the specific sense of resolving, but it was honest, and it was mutual. And in the quiet kitchen of her parents' house on a cold December night in Philadelphia, with her father recovering upstairs and the city humming its steady hum outside the walls, it was enough to build from. Nathaniel drank his coffee. Eleanor drank hers. They sat in a comfortable silence, which was its own kind of answer. And outside the window, the Philadelphia night kept doing what city nights do, loud and close, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something quiet and real had just settled between two people, in a kitchen, on a tree-lined street far from the Wyoming valley where it had all begun, far from the white schoolhouse and the frozen creek, and from the place where both of them, each in their own way, had finally found where they belonged. They left Philadelphia on a Wednesday morning, 8 days after they'd arrived. Harold Whitfield was on his feet by then, not fully recovered, still moving with the deliberate slowness of a man whose body had recently reminded him of its limits, but upright and present, and arguing with the doctor's instructions in a way everyone agreed was an excellent sign. He came to the door to see them off, something nobody had asked him to do, and that Eleanor hadn't expected. He stood on the front steps in his coat, one hand on the rail, and watched them load the car, with the calm, appraising expression of a man cataloging something he intended to remember. He shook Nathaniel's hand again at the door. Longer this time. "You've got a long way back," he said. "We do." Nathaniel nodded. Harold nodded once the way men of his generation nodded when they'd said the real thing sideways and expected it to be understood. Nathaniel understood. He picked up his bag and walked toward the car, and behind him he heard Harold say to Eleanor more quietly, "He's not what I expected." And Eleanor said, "I know. He wasn't what I expected either." A pause, then Harold said very quietly, and not in the tone of a man who said that kind of thing easily, "Good." Nathaniel didn't look back. He got in the car and sat with his bag on his knees and looked out the window at the brick-faced houses along the street. And when Eleanor got in beside him a minute later, he didn't ask what else had been said at the door, and she didn't offer it. And the car pulled away through the streets of Philadelphia toward the station, the city going on with its morning, entirely indifferent to all of it. The train heading west felt different from the train heading east. Nathaniel noticed this sometime around the 3rd hour out of Chicago. The train itself, the same kind of car on the same kind of track, making the same kind of noise. But the quality of the silence between them had changed. Heading east, the silence had been careful. Two people navigating around the edges of something unfinished. Heading west, it was different. Nothing had been formally resolved. No declarations had been made, no plans laid out. But it had settled the way things settle when they've been tested by real circumstances and come through intact. Eleanor slept 2 hours somewhere in Iowa, something she wouldn't have done on the trip east, wouldn't have let herself do, would have considered it a kind of exposure. She slept with her head tipped toward the window, her hands loose in her lap. Nathaniel sat beside her and read the newspaper he'd bought at the Chicago station and didn't examine too closely what it meant, that she'd fallen asleep beside him without apparent worry about it. When she woke, she didn't speak right away. She watched the flat Midwestern country going by and then said without turning, "Do you know what my mother told me the night before we left?" "No," he said. "She said," Eleanor paused, gathering the words, "she said she'd been watching me for 2 days, trying to figure out what was different, and had finally decided it was that I wasn't managing you." She turned to look at him. "She said with every other man she'd ever seen me with, I was managing the situation, controlling the edges. She said with you, she couldn't see me doing that." Nathaniel folded the newspaper. "Is that a good thing?" "She seemed to think so," Eleanor said. "I haven't decided." "Why do you need to decide?" She was quiet a moment. "Because I'm not entirely sure whether it means I trust you, or whether it means I've gotten careless." There was no self-pity in it, just honesty, of the particular kind that comes from someone who's learned to examine her own patterns and doesn't flinch at what she finds. "Could be both," he said. "That's an uncomfortable answer," she said. "You don't usually prefer the comfortable ones," he said. She looked at him a moment, then turned back to the window. "No," she said, "I don't." And something in her voice was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet, softer, less armored. He noticed it and didn't comment on it because commenting would have made her aware of it, and he understood enough about her by now to know she needed to arrive at things at her own pace and on her own terms, and that the fastest way to slow that process down was to point it out before she was ready. The plains opened up again past the Mississippi, wide and white under a January sky, and something in Nathaniel's chest eased that he hadn't known was tight. He hadn't realized until he saw that flat, white horizon again just how much the closeness of the east had been pressing on him. The space wasn't comfortable exactly. It never was. The plains in winter were demanding and indifferent. But it was real in a way the city hadn't felt real. And he breathed it in through the train window and felt something close to relief. "You missed it," Eleanor said, watching him. "The space," he said. "Yeah, I missed it." "Me too," she said, which surprised him. "I've only been out there since October, and I already missed it on the way east. Kept thinking about the mountains in the morning." She paused. "That seems like the kind of thing that would worry a reasonable person. Attaching to a place that fast. Why would it worry you? Because the things you attach to fast have more power over you than the things you come to slowly," she said. "And I've spent a lot of time being careful about what has power over me." He thought about that. "Wyoming got you," he said. "Something got me," she said. And she was looking at him when she said it, steadily, without looking away. And they held that a moment, the thing neither had named formally sitting between them on the westbound train, under winter light visible now, no longer quite unspoken. Then she looked back out the window, and he let it rest. The train kept moving west. They arrived back in Laramie on a Friday night, tired from the trip and quiet, and took the same boarding house rooms they'd used on the way out. Nathaniel lay on the too-short bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the valley waiting for him on the other side of tomorrow's stage ride, the ranch, the creek, the mountains, Jesse Cole, the cattle, and the daily work of a life he'd spent 3 decades building. He thought about how it would look now, with Eleanor in it. Not changed exactly, but different, the way a room looks different once it's been rearranged. Everything still there, just casting different shadows. The stage to Cedar Hollow left Saturday at 7. They were both at the station before 6:40. Cedar Hollow wasn't a town that missed much. This was both the best and the worst thing about living somewhere small. And by the time the stage rolled down Main Street Saturday afternoon, the fact that Nathaniel Calloway and Eleanor Whitfield had come back from Philadelphia together had been known for roughly 2 hours, which was faster than it might have taken in summer, though winter communications had their limitations. Dorothy Cole was in her store window when the stage passed. Walt Higgins was outside the feed store and managed a nod that contained, Nathaniel noticed, an entire editorial on what he was thinking, but had the good sense not to say it out loud. Jesse Cole was at the ranch with a full report ready on the cattle defense and the 3 things that had gone wrong while Nathaniel was away and had since been fixed, delivered with the efficiency of someone who'd been rehearsing it. Nathaniel listened to all of it, inspected the south pasture, checked the water troughs and the state of the hay reserves, and made sure the ranch had survived his absence in reasonable shape. He was home by dusk, sitting by his fire with his boots off and a cup of coffee, and the silence of the ranch settled around him. Not the compressed silence of the Whitfield house in Philadelphia, nor the grinding noise of the train, but the specific silence of 2,000 acres, which had its own texture and its own weight. He sat in it for a long time. The trouble at the school board started on Monday. Nathaniel heard about it from Jesse on Tuesday morning, who'd heard it from Walt Higgins' wife, who'd heard it from a woman at the dry goods store. Everett Boone had called an emergency school board meeting Monday night, citing concerns about the propriety of Miss Whitfield's conduct and its implications for her fitness to continue in her position as a teacher. Nathaniel set down his coffee cup. "What exactly did he say?" he asked Jesse. Jesse shifted his weight. "Apparently said an unmarried teacher traveling across the country with an unmarried man is a matter of," he chose his words carefully, "character? Said the children of this town deserve a teacher of unquestionable character." Nathaniel was quiet a moment, then put on his coat and rode into town. Eleanor was at the schoolhouse when he got there, as he knew she'd be. She was always at the schoolhouse before 7, and it was barely that, sitting at her desk reading something with the particular stillness of a person too angry to move yet. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "You heard. Jesse told me what happened at the meeting." "I wasn't at the meeting," she said. Her voice was even. The evenness cost her. "I wasn't invited. Dorothy told me this morning. Everett is calling it a matter of decorum. He's got 3 of the board members. He needs 1 more for a majority." Nathaniel came in and sat in one of the student chairs, which was too small for him and didn't mind. "Who's the 4th vote he needs?" "Arthur Finch," she said. "He runs the sawmill. Doesn't have strong opinions about most things, but does what Everett recommends because Everett helped him out of a legal matter some years back, and he's never quite gotten out from under it." "I know, Arthur," Nathaniel said. "I imagine you do," she said. She looked at him directly. "Nathaniel, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know this would happen?" "No," he said. "I should have considered it. I didn't." She nodded slowly, accepting that. "It doesn't matter whether it's fair," she said. "It doesn't matter that I traveled with you for reasons that had nothing to do with impropriety and everything to do with my father's illness. What matters is what Everett Boone can do with the appearance of it, and what he intends to do is push me out of this school." "He won't," Nathaniel said. "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to talk to Arthur Finch today," Nathaniel said, anticipating her objection. "I'm not asking him to do anything improper. I'm going to tell him what actually happened and let him make his own decision with full information instead of just Everett's version." He paused. "Everett's been using his influence in this town as leverage for a long time. Most people don't push back because it's easier not to. But Arthur Finch has just never had anyone stand up to Everett on his behalf before." Eleanor looked at him a long moment. "This isn't your fight," she said. "I want to be clear. I'm capable of handling this myself." "I know," he said. "That's not why I'm going." "Then why?" "Because Everett didn't have the right to call that meeting," Nathaniel said clearly. "Didn't have the right to question your character based on a decision you made for legitimate reasons. And he's doing it because he's wanted you gone since you told him his books were inadequate in front of the whole board, and this is his chance. That's the reason, not because you need rescuing." She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze. "All right," she said finally, "but I'm coming with you." "Hoped you would," he said. Arthur Finch's sawmill sat at the north end of town, a sprawling operation that smelled of cut pine even in January. Arthur himself was a stocky, soft-spoken man in his 50s who was perpetually surprised anyone sought out his specific opinion instead of Everett's, and he looked up from his order book with visible uncertainty when Nathaniel and Eleanor walked in together. "Nathaniel," he said. "Miss Whitfield." A pause. "I figure somebody would come." "Then you know why we're here," Nathaniel said. "Everett says," Arthur began. "I know what Everett says," Nathaniel said. "I'm telling you what happened." Miss Whitfield got a telegram in December that her father had suffered a heart attack. She needed to get back to Philadelphia right away. I offered to go with her because it's a 3-day trip and she was traveling alone. We stayed at her parents' house. Her father was sick. We came back. He paused. That's the whole story. Everett's taken that story and turned it into something it isn't, and you know him well enough to know why. Arthur looked uncomfortable. He turned his order book over with one hand, a nervous gesture. "Everett's got a point about appearances," he said, not entirely convinced. "Everett's got a grudge," Eleanor said calmly. "He's had it since October. He's been looking for a way to use it, and he found one. And you're about to give him the vote he needs to make it work." She held Arthur's gaze. "I've been teaching your daughter's classmates for 3 months. I know which kids are struggling and which ones are bored because the material isn't challenging enough, and I tell the difference. I've ridden out to farms in bad weather to visit kids who stopped showing up. I painted that schoolhouse with my own hands because the board wouldn't approve the funds." She paused. "Is Everett Boone's story about my character worth more to you than all of that?" Arthur was quiet a long moment. He looked at Nathaniel. "You two, is there something between you and Miss Whitfield?" "That's between us," Nathaniel said. "It has nothing to do with her fitness to teach." Everett says a lot of things," Nathaniel said. "In my experience, most of them serve Everett." He leaned in slightly. "Arthur, you're a fair man. I've known you 15 years. Do what a fair man does." Arthur looked at his order book, looked at Eleanor, looked at Nathaniel, and then let out a slow breath through his nose and said, "I'll tell Everett I won't support the motion." "Thank you," Eleanor said, simply, directly, without excess. Outside in the cold, she walked 3 steps from the sawmill door before stopping and letting out a breath she'd clearly been holding since before they'd gone in. "That wasn't comfortable," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't like needing help with things like that," she said. Not a complaint, more an admission she'd decided to make. "I know," he said. "You handled it," she said. "We handled it," she said, correcting herself. "Yes," he said. "We did." She looked at him then, in the pale January sun at the north end of Cedar Hollow, the sawmill behind her, the snowy street stretching toward the schoolhouse and the mountains hanging white and enormous beyond the valley. And she said, "I've been thinking about something since the train." "What's that?" he said. "About what you said before we left Philadelphia," she said. "About not wanting to go back to how things were." "I remember," he said. "I don't want to either," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I've been careful for a long time about what I say and what I let myself commit to. And I'm aware that sometimes being careful becomes another word for being evasive. And I don't want to be evasive with you." She paused. "I don't have it all figured out. I don't know how this looks in practice, and there are things we haven't talked about that we'd need to talk about, and I'm not impulsive, generally." "I know," he said. "But I'm not uncertain either," she said, "about this, about you. I want to be honest about that." He stood there in the cold and looked at her. The wind moved down the street between them, lifting the edge of her coat. She held his gaze with the same directness she held everything, not easily, but without flinching. "I'm not uncertain either," he said. The school board met the following Tuesday. Everett Boone brought his motion, and it met 3 votes against 2 without Arthur's support, which wasn't enough, and the motion failed. Everett's expression when Arthur cast his vote was the expression of a man discovering that a lever he'd relied on for years had stopped working without warning. He didn't make a scene. That wasn't his style. He preferred to operate through accumulated pressure rather than open confrontation. But the defeat was real and visible, and the 2 board members who'd supported him looked at their hands when it was over. Dorothy Cole, who wasn't on the board but attended as an interested citizen, the way she attended everything important in town, told her husband that night that she'd watched Everett Boone sit down after the vote with the face of a man who had finally found a wall he couldn't get around, and that Eleanor Whitfield hadn't smiled when it happened, had just nodded and written something in the small notebook she always carried, and that had somehow been more effective than any celebration could have been. After the meeting, several people stopped to talk to Eleanor in the hallway. Not many, but meaningful ones. Margaret Delgado, whose children Eleanor had gone to visit in bad weather. Tom Riley, whose son had started reading 2 grade levels ahead under Eleanor's instruction. Arthur Finch himself, briefly, who shook her hand without much ceremony and went out into the cold. And then, when the hall had mostly emptied, Walt Higgins's wife Rose, who had been in Cedar Hollow 22 years and had seen things come and go, and had her own careful sense of what mattered, came up to Eleanor and said, "We're glad you came back." It was simple and unglamorous, and came from a woman who chose her words carefully because she said few of them. And Eleanor, who had stayed composed through the whole meeting, and the vote, and that entire improbable week, felt something ease slightly in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "Me too." Nathaniel was waiting outside when she came out. He was leaning against the wall of the hall with his coat on, hands in his pockets, watching the street, with the patient quality of a man who was comfortable waiting. He hadn't gone in for the vote. That had been her explicit request, and he'd honored it without argument, something she had noticed and appreciated. She walked over to him. "Well," he said. 3-2, she said. "Everett's motion failed." He nodded, something in his jaw relaxing slightly. "He'll try again," she said. "Not right away, but eventually he'll find another angle." "Let him try," Nathaniel said. "That's easy to say," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I mean it." She glanced at him sideways. The street was quiet, the January cold tightening the sky over the buildings a pale, cloudless blue. The mountains at the edge of the valley were white and enormous and completely indifferent to the school board vote and to Everett Boone and to all that small human machinery grinding away that week. And looking at them, Eleanor felt something like perspective settle over her shoulders like a coat. "Nathaniel?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to walk down to the schoolhouse," she said. "Will you walk with me?" He straightened off the wall. "All right," he said. They walked the 2 blocks to the end of Maple Street without hurrying, through the cold and the quiet, and the schoolhouse was there, as always, white boards against the winter sky. The paint Eleanor had put on with her own hands back in October, now carrying a few months of Wyoming weather and a little less pristine than when it started. But still standing, still clean, still unmistakably hers. She stopped in front of it. Nathaniel stopped beside her. He had stood in this same spot, or near it, the first afternoon she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, stepping off the stage, asking Walt Higgins how to get here, walking up to see for herself the things she'd traveled so far for. He remembered the feeling of that afternoon, the particular mix of determination and apprehension she'd managed, turning it immediately into action, making a list of what needed doing, and starting on the first item before she had time to reconsider. She wasn't the same person standing here now, not so different as to be unrecognizable, but different in the specific ways that months of real life in a real place with real people make a person. Different the way the schoolhouse was different still itself, but carrying the evidence of what had happened to it. She stood with her hands in her pockets and said nothing, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. That he didn't feel silences as awkward, didn't perform presence the way some people did, but was simply there, solid and real and unhurried. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I have something to ask you," he said. She went still, not with surprise exactly. Somewhere in the week just past, on the train heading west, at the sawmill, at the school board meeting, she had felt something building toward a moment, the way weather builds on the horizon before it arrives. She had felt it coming and hadn't tried to rush it or turn it aside. She had just moved through the days until it got here. "All right," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a plain, simple ring. A thin band with a single stone, nothing elaborate, nothing that would have looked right on a Philadelphia parlor table, but that fit perfectly with the schoolhouse, the cold street, the mountains, and the man holding it. "I'm not going to give a speech," he said. "You don't need a speech. I'm not good at them, and you'd see through it anyway." He paused. "I want to marry you," I want to build something with you here, not because I think you need anything from me, I know you don't. Because I think we'd build something better together than either of us would alone. And I think you know that too. And I think we've both been careful long enough." She looked at the ring and looked at his face. "Yes," she said, before he'd finished speaking entirely. He blinked. I know you weren't finished," she said. "Yes, anyway." He stood there in the cold, with the ring in his hand a moment, recalibrating, and then did something she'd seen exactly twice before. The laugh that wasn't quite a laugh, the brief sound of surprise from a man whose composure has been overtaken by something he genuinely feels. He slid the ring onto her hand. It fit, which was improbable, and neither of them mentioned it. She looked at it on her hand in the January light and felt the specific reality of it. Not the romance, not the story, just the plain, heavy fact. She had arrived in Wyoming 14 weeks ago with a leather trunk and no particular plan beyond the teaching position and a general intention to build a life on her own terms. And her own terms, it turned out, included this quiet rancher with the scarred hands and the 28 years of silence, the habit of saying the truest thing available at any given moment, even when it cost him something. "There are things we need to talk about," she said. "Practical things. The school, the ranch, what this actually looks like." "I know," he said. "I'm not giving up teaching," she said. "I know that too," he said. "Never asked you to." "I know you didn't," she said. "I'm saying it out loud anyway because I need it said." "It's said," he said simply. She nodded. Around them, Cedar Hollow went on with its winter morning. A dog crossing the street 2 blocks down, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sound of the mill. An ordinary day in a small frontier town, entirely unaware that something particular had just happened in front of the little white schoolhouse on Maple Street. Eleanor Whitfield, or the woman who would stop being only Eleanor Whitfield before the year was out, looked up at the man who had left a 2,000-acre ranch to travel with her and thought about the question she'd asked him on a frozen porch outside Dorothy Cole's store. "Why did you never marry?" She understood the answer differently now than when he'd first said it. It hadn't been romantic in the way romance usually gets portrayed. It had been something harder and more specific. A man telling the truth about what he'd been waiting for, with no guarantee the wait had been worth it. A man making himself completely available to be wrong. He hadn't been wrong. She hadn't been either. That settled in the cold morning air outside the schoolhouse like the most important thing there was. They married in April, when the snow had cleared from the valley floor, and the creek ran fast and loud with snowmelt, and the first real green of the season showed on the south-facing pastures of the Calloway Ranch. It wasn't a big wedding. Eleanor didn't want big, and Nathaniel didn't want anything to be about performance. So what it was instead was honest. 23 people crowded into the small hall above the feed store because the hall was the largest covered space that wasn't the church, and Eleanor had quietly indicated she preferred a simple, non-religious ceremony, which raised exactly one eyebrow on the town council and was then accepted because by that point, most of Cedar Hollow understood that Eleanor Whitfield operated on her own terms, and her terms had generally produced good results. Dorothy Cole brought food. Rose Higgins brought flowers, early spring things, nothing exotic, just whatever was growing. Jessie Cole stood beside Nathaniel in a jacket that fit imperfectly with the expression of a genuinely moved man, doing his best not to show it. Margaret Whitfield had made the train trip from Philadelphia, arriving 2 days before the ceremony with a single bag, and the composure of a woman who had done all her emotional processing in private before crossing the threshold. Harold hadn't made the trip. The doctor had advised against it, and for once he'd listened. But he'd sent a letter that arrived the morning of the ceremony, which Eleanor read alone in the back room of Dorothy's store, before going upstairs to be married. And whatever that letter said, she kept for herself, though her eyes were brighter when she came out than when she'd gone in. The ceremony was short and simple, and said what it needed to say. When it finished, Nathaniel kissed her once, briefly, with the same quality he brought to everything. No excess, nothing performed. And someone in the small room started clapping, and then everyone was. And Jesse Cole, who had held it together admirably for 40 minutes, finally let his face do what it had been trying to do, and Rose cried the easy way a woman cries at weddings, as a matter of established policy. Eleanor took Nathaniel's hand and looked out at the room full of people she'd known for 6 months, which wasn't much by any reasonable measure, but had been 6 months of real knowing, the kind that accumulates faster in hard circumstances than in easy ones. And she felt something that later, in letters to her mother, she would struggle to name precisely. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, more the specific relief of having arrived somewhere you didn't know you were headed until you could see it behind you. She wrote that to her mother, and her mother wrote back, "That's exactly what it feels like when things are right. You don't recognize them on arrival, only on looking back." The reception ran 3 hours long enough for Walt Higgins to give 2 toasts and for Jesse Cole to tell a story about the winter Nathaniel rebuilt an entire fence section alone in a blizzard, which made everyone laugh and made Nathaniel look at the ceiling with patient resignation. Margaret Whitfield sat beside Rose Higgins, and the 2 women who had nothing obvious in common talked for most of the afternoon, with the absorbed concentration of people who've discovered an unexpected wavelength. Everett Boone didn't attend. Nobody remarked on his absence. They moved into the ranch house that night. Eleanor's things moved from her room above Dorothy Cole's store, which had served as her residence since October, to the bedroom at the back of the ranch house that faced the east pasture and got the morning light first. The house wasn't large and wasn't fancy, and there were several things needing repair that had been on Nathaniel's list for 2 years, which Eleanor identified within the first 48 hours with the diagnostic efficiency of a woman who had painted a schoolhouse herself and wasn't intimidated by a project. "The roof over the kitchen corner," she said on the second morning over coffee. "I know," he said. "The hinge on the north window." "Also no. The porch boards on the left side are soft," she said. "Somebody's going to go through them." "Been meaning to fix that since March," he said. "I'll fix it," she said. He looked at her over his coffee. "You don't have to fix my house. It's my house now," she said gently. "I'll fix what needs fixing." He was quiet a moment, then, "The soft boards are the 3rd and 4th from the left. The rot goes about 6 inches in. You'll need to pull the whole section." "I know how to replace porch boards," she said. "I know," he said, "just giving you the details." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and something easy passed between them. The particular ease of 2 people discovering that the way they operate in the world is against all odds and without either of them designing it, genuinely compatible. She fixed the porch boards that Saturday. He watched from the doorway for about 4 minutes before picking up the second hammer and starting at the opposite end. And they worked from opposite sides toward the middle without discussing it. And when the boards were finished, they stood back and looked at the porch with the shared satisfaction of people who've made something functional that wasn't before. "The kitchen corner's next," she said. "I'll get the ladder," he said. This wasn't, Nathaniel reflected later, what people usually meant when they talked about marriage. The stories tended to live in the big moments, the ceremony, the declarations, the grand gestures. What nobody tells you, or what gets edited out of the retelling, is that the substance of it lives almost entirely in the small ones. The morning coffee, the shared work, the end-of-day conversation that wasn't about anything important and was, for that exact reason, the most important conversation there was. Eleanor went back to the schoolhouse the Monday after the wedding, which surprised nobody who knew her, and prompted exactly the reaction in certain corners of town that she had anticipated, and that Nathaniel had warned her about. The whispering campaign started within the week. Married women teaching was unusual, but a woman who had just gotten married and walked back into her classroom the following Monday with no apparent concern about whether that was proper required a certain amount of community processing. The processing happened in various corners of Cedar Hollow over about 3 weeks. Nathaniel heard about it through the reliable channel of Jesse Cole, who heard everything and had a gift for passing it along without editorializing. The positions were roughly what Eleanor had predicted. Some people thought it was irregular. Some thought it was admirable. Most simply waited to see what happened. What happened was that Eleanor kept teaching, and the children kept learning. And by the time anyone had finished forming a firm opinion, the school term had moved along, and the children's results were visible. And the practical question of whether a married woman belonged in a classroom got considerably harder to sustain when weighed against the fact that the woman in question was clearly good at what she did. Everett Boone tried once more, in September, nearly a year after Eleanor had arrived in Cedar Hollow. He brought a motion to the school board, citing a general policy concern about married teachers and community expectations, without naming Eleanor specifically, which fooled no one. He needed 4 votes. He got 2. Arthur Finch voted against him for the second time. And Tom Riley, whose son had continued to thrive under Eleanor's instruction, and who had, over the past year, developed a backbone regarding Everett Boone he hadn't previously possessed, was the 5th vote against. Everett sat down after the result with the expression of a man who has finally understood something he'd been slow to accept. He didn't bring another motion. Nathaniel hadn't been at that meeting either. He'd been at the ranch, mending a section of fence on the east boundary with Jesse, and when Eleanor got home that evening, he was on the porch, the repaired porch boots off, coffee going cold beside him, and she sat in the chair next to his and said, 3-2. Everett's done. Good, he said. He looked, she paused, searching for the word, tired, like a man who's been fighting something for a year and has finally run out of reasons to. That's what losing something slowly looks like, Nathaniel said. I almost felt sorry for him, she said. He glanced at her sideways. Almost, she said. And they sat on the porch in the September evening, and the mountains held their light for a long time before letting it go. The years passed the way years in the valley pass with the seasons, as the organizing principle, each making its own specific demands, none of them optional. The cattle operation grew steadily under Nathaniel's management. Not an explosive growth, nothing reckless, but the careful expansion of a man who understood that a ranch's health gets measured in decades rather than quarters, and who had the patience to build accordingly. By the time 5 years had passed, the Calloway Ranch ran twice the cattle it had when Eleanor arrived, with 2 additional year-round hands, and a reputation in the valley for honest dealing that was worth more in practical terms than any expansion could have been on its own. Eleanor kept teaching. She added a second classroom in the 3rd year, which required another fight with the school board over funding, which she won by bringing Harold Whitfield's letter of financial backing to the meeting, a letter she hadn't solicited, which Harold had sent unprompted from Philadelphia after Eleanor wrote him a detailed account of the funding situation. Because Harold Whitfield, it turned out, was a man who couldn't read about a problem he could solve and remain comfortably uninvolved. The second classroom meant a second teacher, a young woman named Alice Reed from Laramie, who arrived that September and reminded Eleanor in several specific ways of herself 3 years before. Too self-sufficient, too ready to handle things alone. Not yet understanding that being able to handle things alone and having to handle things alone were at the same condition. Eleanor recognized this because she had been it, and recognized, too, the specific thing that had begun to change it for her, and set out to be for Alice what Dorothy Cole and Rose Higgins had been for her when she arrived. Present without pressure, useful without making a project of it. Alice stayed. 4 years later, she married Tom Riley's younger brother, which Cedar Hollow processed considerably faster than it had processed Eleanor's continued teaching after her own marriage, which amounted to a particular kind of progress. Eleanor and Nathaniel had a daughter in the 4th year. They named her Charlotte, after Nathaniel's mother, and she came into the world in February, On the worst night of that winter's storms, the doctor 30 miles off, on a road that had been impassable since noon, and Nathaniel in the kitchen, doing the only thing available to him, being as useful as possible while managing his fear privately, at which he was better than most. Charlotte arrived safely, which wasn't a given, and which both of them understood wasn't a given. And Nathaniel held her in the stillness after the storm eased and looked at her with the expression of a man who has found something none of his prior experience had prepared him for. "She looks like you," Eleanor said from the bed, exhausted, in the specific way of someone who has just done an enormous physical thing. "She looks like herself," he said. "She's 20 minutes old." "She has your mouth," Eleanor said. "That's a very small mouth to be identifying," he said. "I don't know how you can tell." "I can tell," Eleanor said, with the absolute conviction of a woman who has just done all the work and earned the right to make determinations. Charlotte Calloway grew up between the ranch and the schoolhouse, which meant she grew up understanding the world was made of work and learning, in roughly equal parts, and that both were things you didn't wait around to be handed. She wasn't an easy child. She'd inherited her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness in a combination that made her simultaneously the most interesting and most exhausting person in any room she occupied, a description several people in Cedar Hollow applied to both her parents and never said to either of their faces. She started school at 5 in her mother's classroom, which caused exactly the kind of complicated dynamic you'd expect from a girl who knows the teacher as her mother and has worked out the implications in a way that mostly served Charlotte's interests. Eleanor handled it with the patience of a woman who had been managing classrooms for years, and the extra light effort of a woman who was also managing her own daughter. And if she sometimes came home and told Nathaniel that Charlotte had tried to argue her way out of an arithmetic exercise by citing a loophole in the school rules, Nathaniel listened with an expression of careful neutrality that occasionally broke into something clearly a suppressed laugh. "That's you coming out in her," Eleanor said about the arithmetic dodge. "The technical argument," Eleanor said, "that's entirely your approach. I've never once dodged arithmetic in my life," he said. "No," she nodded. "You avoid conversations by finding the precise edge of what's been asked and staying just inside it." A pause. "She does the same thing with school rules." "That's an uncomfortably precise observation," he said. "I know," she said. "I've had 11 years to develop it." There were hard years too, because there always are. The winter of their 7th year was severe even by Wyoming standards, and they lost a significant part of the herd to a cold snap that arrived 3 weeks earlier than the previous decades had suggested was possible. Nathaniel took the loss with the outward steadiness with which he took most things, but Eleanor had learned by then to read the specific quality of his silences, and knew this one was different, heavier, settled in a deeper place than practical worry. "How bad?" she asked on the 3rd night after the count. "Manageable," he said. "It'll set us back, tighten things for a while." "How much?" 2 years of growth, maybe 3, he said. "We'll be fine." She sat across the kitchen table, the same kitchen table that had witnessed most of their real conversations, years of them accumulated now. She looked at his face, which did the thing it did when something cost him more than he was saying. "Nathaniel?" she said. He looked at her. "It's just cattle," she said, not dismissively. She knew exactly what that cattle represented in years of work and careful planning. She said it the way he'd said things to her when she needed them said plainly. "We'll rebuild." He was quiet a moment, then said, "I know it's sitting on you like it's more than that." He turned his cup on the table. "Built this place over 30 years alone," he said slowly. "When something went wrong, it went wrong for me. Now it goes wrong for us. That's different. The weight of it is different." She looked at him across the table. "It's worse," she said. He considered it, honestly, the way he considered things. "No," he said. "It's just more." He looked up. It matters more. That's what I wasn't ready for. How much more everything matters. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Neither said anything for a moment, and the kitchen was quiet, and Charlotte was asleep down the hall, and outside Wyoming winter did what it always did, absolute and indifferent, and entirely without malice. And inside the two of them sat, with the accumulated weight of 7 years of building something together that was real enough to hurt when it took a hit. "We'll rebuild," she said again. "We will," he said, and turned his hand under hers. They rebuilt. It took 3 years as he'd estimated, and they weren't easy years, but they were years with a direction which made them manageable. The herd came back stronger than it had been because Nathaniel had used the contraction to be more selective about what he rebuilt, with a principle he applied to most things. By the 10th year, the Calloway Ranch was considered one of the most reliable operations in the valley. Not the biggest, not the most profitable in raw terms, but the most consistent. The kind of operation other ranchers pointed to when trying to explain to somebody younger what good management looked like over time. Eleanor's school grew alongside it. A 3rd classroom was added in the 8th year, this one funded entirely by the community, which wouldn't have happened in year 1, and which represented a shift in the town's understanding of what education was worth, a shift Eleanor had spent 8 years quietly organizing, through results rather than arguments. Everett Boone sold his interest in the school board in the 6th year and largely withdrew from public life. Not dramatically, but with the quiet fading of a man whose particular kind of influence had depended on an absence of alternatives, and who had watched alternatives accumulate around him until his position simply wasn't what it had been anymore. He still lived in Cedar Hollow, and Eleanor was courteous to him when their paths crossed, which wasn't often, and he was courteous back, which was the best available outcome, and one they both understood as such. Cedar Hollow changed in the years that followed, the way places change when the people living in them choose to build instead of merely maintain. The schoolhouse became what newer families cited when explaining why they'd chosen this valley over others. The Calloway Ranch became a place younger ranchers came to with questions and got honest answers without condescension. The town built a proper library in the 10th year, a project that started as a letter Eleanor wrote to the county and turned over 18 months of organized effort into an actual building on the corner of Maple and 3rd, small but real, with a reading room that Charlotte Calloway would use as a second home for most of her childhood. Margaret Whitfield visited 3 times in the first 10 years, each time staying longer than the last, each time leaving with the particular reluctance of a woman whose center of gravity had been quietly relocating itself without her permission. On her 3rd visit, she sat on the repaired porch on an October afternoon and looked at the mountains and said to Eleanor and Nathaniel, and no one in particular, "I understand why you stayed." "The mountains," Eleanor said. "Everything," Margaret said. "The mountains are part of it, but it's the scale of things, the way things are in proportion here. You can see what matters because there's nothing standing between you and it." She paused. "In Philadelphia, everything is mediated. There are layers between you and the real thing. Out here, there aren't any layers." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's what makes it hard too." "Yes," Margaret said, "but at least you know what you're dealing with." There was something in that conversation that Eleanor thought about for years afterward. The way you turn a stone over and keep finding new surfaces. Because that was what had happened to her in this valley, she realized. Not that she'd found something she was looking for, but that the layers had been stripped away, one by one, until she was dealing with the real thing, real work, real weather, real people. And eventually with the real question a certain rancher had answered outside Dorothy Cole's store on a frosty December morning. She had asked him why he'd never married. He had said, "Because I was waiting for you." She understood that answer differently at 44 than she had at 34. At 34, it had frightened her because it was so unguarded. A man with nothing shielding something that could hurt him. She'd briefly thought it was reckless. She understood now it was the opposite. It was the most considered thing he'd ever done. The decision over 28 years to refuse to settle for something that wasn't right, to wait, not out of fear, but out of an honest understanding of what he actually needed. Even when that honesty was costly, and when it looked from the outside like simple isolation, he had known what he was waiting for. He just hadn't known who. That was the distinction it had taken her years to fully understand. One afternoon in the fall of their 12th year, Nathaniel was on the porch when Eleanor came out from putting Charlotte to bed. Charlotte was 11 now and increasingly resistant to the concept of bedtime, which she considered an imposition, and whose negotiation required more energy than Eleanor often had left at the end of a school day. She sat in her chair and picked up her cold coffee and looked at the mountains holding the last of the day's light. "She asked me something tonight," Eleanor said. "Charlotte," he said. "She asked me how I knew you were the right one to marry." He was quiet. "What did you tell her?" Eleanor looked at the mountains a moment. "I told her you were the first person I'd met in a long time who told me the truth when it would have been easier not to," she said. "And that I decided to trust that, and that trusting it had cost me something and had been worth it. That's usually how you know." Nathaniel was still on the other side of the porch. "What did she say?" he said after a moment. "She said that was a complicated answer," Eleanor said. "She also said she thought you probably married me because I was the only person in town who wasn't afraid of you." Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. "That's a simpler answer," he said. "She said she figured they were probably both true," Eleanor said. "She's 11, and she's already figured out that the simple answer and the complicated one are usually both true at the same time." "That's you coming out in her," he said. "The impatience with being told to go to bed is you," Eleanor said. "I always slept fine," he said. "You sleep fine now because you're exhausted by 5 in the afternoon," she said. "You're up before sunrise every single morning, which isn't the behavior of a man with a natural relationship to rest." "I've got work to do," he said. "You always have work to do," she said. "That's different." He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, the one that still surprised her slightly after 12 years because it appeared so rarely and so unexpectedly. And she looked at him in the fading October light, this man she hadn't expected, in a valley she hadn't planned, in a life that had become so completely hers that she could no longer picture the shape of the alternative, and felt the specific gratitude of someone who understands, without sentimentality, how close she had come to missing something. She had asked a question on a porch once because she'd been genuinely curious, and because she'd never in her life seen the point of not asking things she wanted to know. She hadn't asked the question expecting what it produced. She hadn't known that the man standing in front of her was carrying an honest answer that had been waiting for someone willing to hear it. The valley had been there before them, and would be there after. The creek with no name on any map kept running, still carrying the snowmelt down from the peaks through the lower pastures, still indifferent to human arrangements. The schoolhouse on Maple Street was still white, repainted every few years now by community effort, still the place where the valley's children came to find the idea that the world was bigger than what they could see from their own front porch. Some of those children were adults now. Some had left the valley and come back. Some had gone and stayed gone, which was fine. The point of the learning was never to keep people in one place, but to give them the ability to choose their place freely. Eleanor had understood that from the start, and had never taught toward any other end. What the valley remembered, the way small places remember things not in monuments or official records, but in the way people talked, and in what they chose to pass along, wasn't the school board fight, or the trip to Philadelphia, or even the wedding above the feed store in the April rain. What it remembered was simpler than all of that, and more lasting. It remembered that there had been a man who told the truth when it was harder than silence, and a woman who asked the question nobody else had thought to ask, and that the combination of those two things in the cold, in the ordinary middle of an ordinary morning outside a general store in a small town at the edge of a mountain valley had turned out to be enough. More than enough. It had turned out to be everything.